Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to wrap up today with a special selection, which is where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. Today's comes at us from Deeps, a very progressive death metal band from Brazil that seemingly came out of nowhere. If nothing else, I do want to spread the word of this obscure band. So let's dive into this. They are so obscure or possibly so new that I couldn't find them on anything other than YouTube. So they're called Medicine Death. We're going to dive into a track called Divineness From The Forest. Let's dive in, see what's going on. Alright, I know I haven't been saying much. This is overwhelming. Okay. Very obtuse rhythm. So pretty much all of these little groups start on the and but four beat. Little pickup notes into the downbeat. Shifting to the downbeat. Why didn't it 4 fit on the transition? I think that might have been variation. Okay, a sitar-like sounding instrument while also pushing into Phrygian. Chugging underneath. I think this has been their strongest section so far. And I'll dive into this in the analysis segment. Using the guitars to introduce a rhythm that the hi-hat would take moving forward, or not moving forward. This is the same chugging from the previous section without the higher pitched. Yeah, we just kind of have silence in that pocket. We do have that though. Not quite as high pitched, but doing the same job. Fun hi-hat work back there. That, I don't know, turn of the century synth pad back there. It's an interesting choice. Beautiful piano here though. A little bit of a jazzy turn. An interesting combination of the distortion of the metal earlier, the light, ethereal synth and piano, and the growls. And that riff was from the beginning of the song, so that's a really nice callback. Okay. I have to get this out of the way before we dive into anything else. There is a strong element of, I don't necessarily want to imply everything of this word, but I can't really think of a better way to describe this. It's amateurish. I don't want that to say that the band doesn't know what they're doing or that there's nothing good in this song or anything like that. We're going to dive into some really cool ideas here, but it's one of those situations where I hear a lot of potential but failed execution. I think there are some solid concepts on this. I think some ideas are really well thought out, but I also think that the production, the general pacing, the fluidity of the track, the cohesiveness of the performance. A lot of things just aren't in the best of states. And it tells me that they have really grand ideas and are very ambitious with this song. And that tells me that there's a lot of potential for them to develop into like a powerhouse progressive metal outfit. But this offering right here shows me more potential than it does current level of skill. And I want just everyone to understand that I say this as somebody who wants to see this band succeed. To get better at a craft, you have to be told where you're faltering. If you're just given praise all the time, you're not really going to grow as well as you could if you had constructive criticism. And criticism is kind of the backbone of this channel. It's even in the channel name. I mean, we're critical reactions here. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this and say that this was phenomenal, but I do want to get this out before I even start talking about the song itself, in that there's really great ideas here. And I think that if this were given more time, or if they tried to tackle this a little later in their journey as musicians, I do think that this song would have really worked well. And that a lot of it would have just seemed very effortless. But as it stands, it is a very rough work that seems like they bit off more than they can chew, but does show a lot of potential and passion and ambition. And I love music like this, to kind of show where people are at a certain period in their journey, and to kind of have a bit of look of where they could go if they progress with this. And I really love, I don't know how old this band is. The album art looks like it's from the 70s maybe. So, but the comments mention that they came out of nowhere. So is this a new release? Okay, no, this was from 95. Okay. Because I was going to say, the video itself is 2025 too. But according to the description, the band released this album as a vigorous and lustful figure back in 1995. So that kind of recontextualizes some of this, because I'm comparing, especially on the production side in my mind, to modern death metal production and progressive metal production. And that's not fair, because this is from 30 years ago. Good gravy. Why? The 90s don't feel that far away. But yeah, so that kind of changes my mind on things a little bit. If this was a garage band, and they didn't have access to a large amount of funds for production, that kind of plays into the way that it sounds. So I'm not going to talk about that too much then. The production on this is, I think, a weak point. It is consistent across the different sections of the track, but it might have been the best that they could get or work with, or maybe they self-produced even, and they just weren't producers and did what sounded best to their ear and stuff like that. So I'm not going to bring that up then. I think the compositional side is where I'm going to stick with in this analysis then. So, getting into that, this song goes through a lot of ideas. We start off with fast, technical death metal. I don't know if I really want to put this into the realm of tech death, but it is technical, and it's certainly aggressive death metal. We move from that into kind of just more straightforward metal. I guess it's still death metal, just less technical. We get the growls coming in. We kind of play around with this sound for a little bit, developing different riffs and rhythms within it. And then we lighten things up. We bring in a synth pad, which I'd mentioned that it kind of feels like a turn of the century synth pad in 95. I mean, that's... I thought it was sort of a retro aesthetic, but it would definitely have been the way synths popularly sound at the time. But we also have some piano stuff in here. We lighten the entire feel of the song. We bring in jazzier harmonic ideas. Completely forgot about the string stingers that were probably done with the synth pad as well. They're very quiet, pushed into the background of what I'm going to assume is a chorus during those opening death metal sections. So we already had a little bit of this electronic, digital side of things already showcased there. But here, I mean, we have a synth pad just droning in the background, creating this light, ethereal sounds, very different from the metallic element. Um, this piano I mentioned, kind of a jazzy idea, very flourishy, lots of quick little movements, some spicy notes thrown in there. It's not just that it has that dexterity that you typically hear in jazz piano work as far as melody writing goes, but it also brings in some jazz harmonic ideas. We have the Phrygian section, which I think actually came before this one, that introduced the sitar sounding instrument and the Phrygian mode. Um, and then eventually we kind of smashed all of this together, bringing the growls back. I mean, there were cleans. I completely forgot about that. We have clean vocals too, but then we bring the growls back. We have the piano and the synth, but we have a chugging guitar line from one of the death metal sections, and it's just a really wild ride of a lot of varying ideas that don't really connect well with each other, but they certainly all exist at the same time at one point in the song. And I actually found that moment to work. I don't know if the build up into it was effective in its execution, but that moment of having the synth and the piano and the guitars and the growls, bringing the aggression of the metal with the light relaxation of the jazz piano and the ethereal synth, that worked. And I think I was more astounded by the fact that they took all of these disparate parts and smashed them together into something that worked than I would have been if that section had just appeared on its own. Kind of taking these piecemeal components and making this composite section out of all of that was really impressive. And that's just, I mean, it's one of those things where I see so much potential. If Medicine Death had worked up to that a little more fluidly and had ideas merging into each other and the sections and it feels so disparate, I really think that that moment would have landed somehow even better. It's just kind of a rough going to getting to that point. So there's a lot of influences here. I think they pull off most of them well. You know, the jazzy sections sound right. It's not just a jazzy sound, but actually incorporates some jazz composition. I mean, you can't really say too much about the synth as it is just chords, just harmonies, but they do have a very ethereal, light, lacking gravity feel to that, which is harmonically not present anywhere else. So they have to understand how those chords work to achieve those sounds. I mean, if you play metal music your entire life, you're gonna have some difficulty finding, what makes a jazzy sound jazzy. What kind of chords do you need for that? What makes an ethereal sound ethereal? What kind of chords do you need for that? So they actually have a really strong grasp, at least within these three different ideas of chord theory, and understanding what types of chords and more specifically chordal movements you need in order to craft these wildly different ideas. And so again, that's one of those areas where I see a lot of potential and a lot of musical knowledge, whether that is academic or gut. I mean, some people, they just have that innate feeling for music and they've never gone to school for it at all. And they can just I want to make this sound. I think it's this. And just kind of I don't know, dude, that whole side of music really fascinates me because I don't have that. I had to go to school to get my musical knowledge. And I think it's fascinating when people are just have that attunement to this art. And it's not just, this art form either. Just anytime I see somebody just with an innate gift and just this understanding within their being of how to draw or how cinematography works or photography and any of it, dance, just naturally exuding this knowledge, like arcane built within them. That just fascinates me. I think that's just awesome. Anyways, I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. That knowledge is in this band, and like I said, a lot of potential. Wasn't really wielded in a way I felt was done well as far as fluidity. Let's talk about that. Because even though that section of bringing everything together worked well and the individual ideas were executed well, the overall pacing and flow is just kind of off. I thought the metallic sections in the first 2 or 3 minutes worked well. We went from that technical death into regular death. We had a couple riffs in there. We brought the strings in the chorus to kind of create this quasi symphonic metal thing going on there. I think most of this works well. The transitions themselves are a bit rough, but it all makes sense to move through these ideas. We have a lot of intensity. We back off of that intensity in order to create space for the vocals. And then we want to ramp the intensity back up, but not with a lot of notes. So we need to do it with layers or volume. So let's bring in some strings. Not only is that going to give us these larger sounds on the outside, not only can we expand the harmonic element here and focus on larger chords, more expressive chords, but we can also bring in this new texture, and the strings themselves have a feeling that, I think works really well with metal and embellishes the emotions metal typically wants to explore. So I think this general movement worked well. Again, the transitions were a bit rough, but metal across the board, from the most novice metal players to the titans of the genre, have all played around with harsh transitions. It's a part of the genre that, I don't know, it just feels baked into it. But then after we get out of that point, I feel like the song heads into a direction of just anything goes. What was already harsh transitions are now harsh transitions into things that have no connection to anything prior. Granted, again, a lot of this was building up to this big composite section, but there just isn't anything here that connects these ideas. There is an attempt to have carryovers or foreshadowing. There's a couple of places in here where I was like, oh, this new instrument introduced a rhythm that the drums picked up in the next section, or this was a callback rhythmically or melodically to this other riff in the past. But they never really did much with it. It was more of a, oh, they did that, like a neat little Easter egg. I don't really think that it did a lot to carry the song forward, but it was a way to attempt to tie ideas together. In fact, that one time that I just mentioned was the rhythmic idea. The guitars introduced a rhythm in their riff, and then eventually that rhythm entered into the hi-hat on the drums for the next section. That was very cool. And if you remember my reaction to it when I called it out, that next section was only 4 bars long, and then they went into something totally different. The idea of carrying this idea over, of creating foreshadowing for what would come later, ended up being a moot point because we didn't actually do anything with that. We discarded it all to start fresh again, completely disrupting the pacing and fluidity of this moment. It really was, to me, a section where I felt like they were finally getting a hold of things. The song was a wild beast, and they were finally wrangling it. They were taming it. And as soon as I felt like they had control over the situation, the beast begins to buck again. And the song just goes in a wildly new direction. Now, this could all be thematically purposeful, too. There's always that side of things that I haven't looked at the lyrics. Maybe this is about trying to gather control over something chaotic, and the song's unwillingness to have any sort of fluidity or consistency or linear, well, it is very linear, but smooth movement between ideas is part of that. It's creating something chaotic because the song is about something chaotic. But while I was listening to it, I really didn't hear much besides, this 40 seconds was neat. And then this 40 seconds was neat. And then this 60 seconds was neat. And then this 40 seconds was just a bunch of really neat ideas that just got smashed together into a song. And it never really became anything more than a series of neat ideas for me. And again, from a specific thematic perspective, that can be quite effective for the artistic intent of the song. But it never really feels like that's the purpose. Again, to me, this feels very amateurish. It doesn't feel like a collection of ideas or an anthology of vignettes or something like that. It feels like, hey, we wrote a bunch of riffs and didn't know how to combine them. And unfortunately, there really isn't much of a theory, a music theory angle for me to say, this will feel more cohesive, and this is why. And this song doesn't feel cohesive, and this is why. It's very much a gut thing. And this song just never quite clicks. It doesn't feel like there's an artistic through line to this. It just feels like a series of totally disconnected ideas. And I do want to put also a subjective element on that. To me, that feels like it doesn't work, but maybe you listened to this and thought it was fantastic. That's always a possibility too. Moving to another slightly negative aspect. And this was interesting too, because I'd mentioned once we got to that Phrygian point, I said, oh, the song's starting to finally come together. This was actually twofold. The first was that we had linear melodic ideas. We didn't really have too much of that previously. The prior 4 minutes or so was growling, so that's texture, drums did rhythm, and the guitars did riffs. Cyclical, there's the word, cyclical ideas that might have melodic elements to them, but isn't designed to tell a story. They're designed to create a vibe, to create a feel. And so at this point, we had finally stuck with an idea for a pretty long set of time. We had melodic through point through it. And the other thing that's really important is that there was a tightness to the performance. The song kicks off with some really rough playing. Part of it, I think, is the speed. This tech death section is difficult to play quickly and accurately, and difficult to play for a group of people to all be in time with everyone else, while also being accurate with all of their notes and timings. But once we got out of this, they kind of locked in a little more. Granted, in those death riffs, those death metal riffs, we still hear a bit of inconsistency, temporal, between the musicians in the group, but it's a bit tighter. But once we hit this point, the Phrygian mode, bringing in the sitar-like instrument, things really click with timing. Everybody kind of locks in, and it feels like they are working as a whole now. Then we hit the jazz section, or maybe the jazz section came before this. We hit the composite section though, and then we come back to the opening tech death riff. And I even called this out in the reaction. I was like, oh, this is the opening riff again. And once again, the timing just gets thrown out the window. This is a very rough segment for them. And I don't know what kind of constraints they were looking at. Maybe they just needed to get the album out. Maybe they were getting burned out. Maybe the recording session, they already paid for it and they just had to get in and do their best. I have no idea what kind of constraints they were on. But this section, I think more than anything else in the song, needed a little bit more practice from pretty much everyone. It's tough for me to discern who's rushing and who's dragging when everybody's out of time with each other. Maybe the drummer was locked in and the others weren't, but it's impossible to tell when everybody's as scattered as what's going on here. So I think this section in particular, felt more weak to me. It's another one of those ideas where there's a lot of potential. I think the riffage is strong. I think the technicality to it is interesting. I think they needed to work on it, practice it just a little bit more to get it nailed down. And again, another subjective thing. I've certainly heard the comments from y'all. You like rougher playing. Metal feels best when it isn't locked in. And I get that to a point. Quantized, perfected playing, I think works really well at the highest level. Your fastest tech death out there, your progressive metal, you really want that perfection, even though I think, some of y'all have told me it's too sterile, too clean. But this, I think, moves too far in the other direction. This is too rough for, I think, a general audience. That's not to say that some people won't find this attractive or appealing sonically, but I don't. This, to me, just completely screams we have not practiced enough for this performance. And again, coming from a classical and jazz world, you you practice until you have it perfect. And if you don't have it perfect for the time that you play, especially if you're in a group, like you're in a large, 60 person orchestra or something like that, you just don't play that part. Or if you're a solo section, you hand that off to someone else who can play, because there is a second chair who's been practicing it, ready for you to say, "Hey, I got this." Like perfection is so ingrained into those cultures that something like this is just so foreign to me. So, like I said, some people might like it. I don't. I've had it trained in my brain so long that you don't want to be rough and muddy like this. But then they lock in the middle, and I really want to give that some praise too. I know I've been, hammering down on this a little bit, but they really lock in. And granted, it is less technical, less difficult to play that section, but it sounds good. The band sounds connected. They sound like a single, unit, and they're just all perfectly locked into everybody, in sync. And the music sounds great. We have melodic ideas here, which I've been craving just because I like melody in my music. And the performance is great. And that's why, I mentioned like this part's really strong. Even though I think some of the other ideas are more interesting, I don't think that this was necessarily the most fascinating part of the song, but it is the part where I feel like everything just worked. There were no rough edges on this. I have no complaints about this moment. It is everything that it needed to be. And I thought that the movement into it was okay. It was still a rough transition, but we still kind of carried some ideas into it. I don't remember moving out of the section, so I can't comment on that. But it's just like this was when I really saw, okay, if they clean things up a little bit, the whole song could have been like this moment. And that's again is to me is one of the strong sections where I see potential in this group. The last thing I want to touch on is the vocals. They're very strong vocals. I just want to get that out of the way. They are low, they are guttural. There is a ferociousness to them. There's something very animalistic about them. And there's actually a strong clarity to them, not necessarily in the enunciation, but within the production itself. I can hear the beginnings of it, I can hear the ends of it. It isn't just this vague rumbling that appears. There's a strong attack and a strong end to these sounds. But I'll tell you, man, I cannot understand this at all. I don't know if it was in English or not, simply because I barely heard anything beyond this low sub bass rumble. And that is sort of impressive in itself. And again, this is going to be a subjective thing. I just like clarity to my harshes. And I think there's a way to achieve this general sound and effect while increasing the clarity of the words themselves. Because it's not like the vocalist is tucking their vocals into the mix. It's not like they're trying to disguise them and make them pure texture. They are there on top of everything else. There's attention drawn to them, but then it's just this sound. And I kind of think that there could be a little bit more done. And I don't know if that's a production thing. I don't know if that's a sonic production thing of how the person is doing the harsh. But again, it's another place where they're like right on the cusp, a little bit of a change. I don't even know if I would call this an improvement, because it's definitely a more subjective thing. But a little bit of a change, I think, would really help that stand out a little bit more. I think that's about it, man. This is a very impressive track. And I'm intrigued to see where this group went. I'd be really disappointed if I find out this is their only album and that they had all of this ambition and then for whatever reason couldn't, and that happens to a lot of bands. It costs a lot of money to be a musician full time. And sometimes it's just, actually, I'm going to say most of the time, it just doesn't work out. There's really skilled, impressive musicians that just never make it big and have to, do other things with their life because we have to make money to live. And being a musician very, very rarely ever covers that. Let's hit some lyrics. Let's see if I can find some lyrics. All right. So I suppose it's kind of cliche at this point with older metal band and even newer metal bands too, although I think modern day we kind of see it more in black metal, but basically a pagan hymn. It's a song whose lyrics primarily sing praise for darker deities. Um, the language here though is a bit rough for me. This is mostly a gut read that I have on it, more so than these specific lines say this specific thing. Let me just read some of this to you. The penultimate stanza, and stanza is an interesting word here because it's more like paragraphs. It's not written out in poetic meter. It's just paragraphs of sentences. It reads more like spoken word, which is interesting because the growls, maybe we could go in that direction, something along similar to sing-songy, where it's kind of spoken but kind of sung. There is a rhythmic component to it. But there is straight up singing in this too, and yet none of these lyrics feel like they could be sung, at least not the way that they're written, because there's no implied meter to the way it was written. But anyways, this penultimate stanza, awaken fairies of the Kabbalah, open the pentagram of the omnipotent, free phoenix, the carrier of the Holy Spirit of Pan, rip the heavens, dismember the bowels of the fields, and listen to the voice of the Lord coming from the mouth of the dragon that says, I am the only usufructor and Lord of all sacrifices. Then those who do not recognize my true transcendental nature will fall. We have woodland elements to it. We have fairies. We also have pentagrams. We have Pan. We are ripping the heavens and dismembering the fields. I mean, it's a lot of very standard iconography for more dark ritualistic lyrics. And that's pretty much what all of this is about. There is one stanza that I'm curious how they came about this because it is just a lot of blank of the blank, blank of the blank of the blank of the blank, blank of the blank. And once I picked up this pattern, it kind of made me chuckle a little bit simply because of this repetition. Says she will bring what was incumbent to her, the cosmic fluid of the spinal medulla, of the vital movement, of the orgasmic dance, of the metaphysic growing that searches the annihilation of the ego, the unction of the multiple immaterial layers of the galaxies. It definitely feels large, though, larger than life. I think that's why I used the word hymn earlier. It's not just a song that sings praise, but it feels like a hymn. Larger than life, focusing on deities, speaking their praises. All right. This is interesting. This was also their second album and their last. They had a 92 album, this 95, although they did put out a single in 2025 called Cenobite. This was back in April. I wonder, do we have a lineup? We do have a lineup. Is this the same group? Looks like the drummer and bassist is the same, and vocalist. But I think they have a new guitarist. Yep. And the guitarist also is listed as a vocalist. So they lost two guitarists, got one new guitarist, and he also does vocals. Interesting. They dropped from a 4-piece to a 3-piece, but kept the rhythm section. I wonder who composed on this then, because the drums and the bass, they did great work. The drummer has some really interesting patterns in here, some interesting rhythms, and ultimately even has some melodic drumming elements. I like the drumming for the most part on this. The bass is more standard. There are some moving bass lines, but a lot of it is pedal note stuff. Very common for 95 or 90s metal in general, but neither of those are really melodic elements. If the guitarist, one of the two guitarists, were one of the lead melodic writers, maybe even the lead harmonic writer, it'll be interesting to see what this band does with a totally different composer. And I think that's an interesting part that just doesn't get captured in data too often. We have band members, but we don't often see who the composer is. And I assume that's because it's assumed most bands are collective outfits. Everybody just writes, I play the bass, so I write the bass parts. I write I play the guitar, I play the guitar parts. And maybe that does happen more often than I would think. But I always assume there's either one or two key composers, the main writers for the group. And when those leave the band, I think that's when the identity of the band musically has a moment to really shift. Even if everyone else is the same, just having that one band member swapped out can bring a very different sound to an upcoming album. So, I don't know, I'm kind of curious. I might listen to the single that they released a couple months ago, just kind of see how it compares. I mean, we're also talking 30-year difference too. I wonder if they practiced in those 30 years or if they only picked the instruments back up recently. Oh, like I said, it's going to be interesting. Maybe I'll make a reaction to that even. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Otherwise, these are my thoughts on Medicine Death's Divineness From The Forest. Let me know what you thought of this. If there's anything that stood out to you, anything you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on. If you have a different perspective or opinion on this track, please put all of that and any other thoughts you have down into the comment section. Above that, in the description box is a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.